Okay, I think we are going and we are live on Facebook. Welcome. Thanks to everybody who's joining us out there in Facebook land, wherever you might be in the world. We're thrilled to be able to present to you on behalf of Emory University a terrific group of experts to talk about the state of Georgia and the state of change, red, blue, or purple. I'm Michael Elliott. I am the Dean of Emory College of Arts and Sciences. I'm also the Charles Howler Candler Professor of English, and I'm joined today by three experts both from Emory and from Atlanta to talk about the fact that Georgia now is in national and even international headlines because of the state of political change. We have with us Andra Gillespie, the Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference here at Emory University. We have David Schweidel, my colleague from the Business School, who is Associate Professor of Marketing and also co-director of Emory Marketing Analytics Center at Goizueta. And then I'm thrilled to be able to welcome to us a guest from outside the campus, Chris Clark, who's the President and CEO of the Georgia Chamber of Commerce. And prior to joining the Georgia Chamber, Chris served as Commissioner of the Georgia Department of Natural Resources and as Deputy Commissioner for the Department of Economic Development. And we will have time for a few questions at the end as well. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Facebook Live chat and they will get funneled to us. But I'm going to start by doing a kind of round robin with our experts to give them a chance to reflect on what they're seeing and how they're understanding the impact of what's transpiring right now in Georgia politics. And let me start with you, Andra, if I could. As a political scientist, I'm curious how you're perceiving the transition in the state of Georgia, how much these categories, red state, blue state, purple state, matter to you, and what your perceptions are.
Well, thank you, Michael, for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. When I first saw the title for this program, my initial response was to answer the question, which was Georgia is purple. So Georgia is not blue just because Joe Biden won the presidency. And so I just think it's really clear for us to understand that what we're entering now is a phase of increased competitiveness electorally. So we've gotten used for the last 20 to 30 years thinking of Georgia as being a reliably Republican state, particularly at the national level, and that's shifting. And so we're entering a period where I expect that the margins and races are going to be narrow, and that Democrats are going to win some elections and Republicans are going to win some elections. And this is actually not unusual. It actually took a long time for Georgia to become a reliably Republican state. The dynamics that sort of prompted that shift in the 1980s and 90s are different than what we're seeing happening today. But it's important to know we've been through this period before where races tend to be close, where there are runoffs often, and where Democrats and Republicans sometimes win. It's just that, in the 80s, it was white Democrats who were shifting their party identification to the Republican Party. And what we're seeing happening now are increasing groups of people of color who are more likely to vote Democratic. And so long as that trend continues, and those populations are growing relative to the white population in the state, which is still very more Republican than Democratic, we can expect to see competitive races probably for, the next decade or so.
Well, first of all, I'm curious if you were surprised at all by the results of the national election, by the presidential election in Georgia. And then how are you thinking about the transition in terms of voting trends from the presidential national election to the Senate runoffs that are now transpiring?
I can't say that I was surprised. I didn't know what the outcome of the election was going to be. But what I expected was that the margins were going to be close. So keep in mind that in 2012, Barack Obama lost Georgia by about 9 percentage points. And then Hillary Clinton lost by about 5 percentage points in 2016. And so what I was expecting was that the margin was going to be less than 5. And it was just a question of whether or not Joe Biden or Donald Trump was going to win. And in general, Democrats for a long time have been talking about the date when Georgia was going to flip blue. And they were looking at demographic trends and being a little premature, making the assessment about when Georgia was going to flip because they were relying on young people to vote who hadn't quite hit their apex of voting behavior yet. But, what the trends were showing, not just in the presidential race, but also in gubernatorial races and other places, was that the Democrats were slowly gaining on on Republicans in the state. And so it was just a matter of time. It could have happened in 2020, but I was also prepared for it to happen in 2022 or 2024. So, it was just a matter of sort of when the window is, but knowing that we were headed in that direction was probably, what I was looking at. So I can't say that I was terribly surprised that Joe Biden ended up winning.
Do you think the dynamics will be different for the Senate runoffs?
Well, they are different because a presidential race and a Senate runoff election are two different animals. So, it's an apples to oranges comparison. The electorates are going to look different. Fewer people are going to turn out for the runoff than turned out for the general election, because people know to show up in November of leap years for presidential elections, it takes more education to get people to turn out to vote. In a runoff election, particularly one that's right after the New Year's holiday, when people have had lots of time to be distracted, even with all the television ads. That seems crazy for me to say, but people don't usually show up for runoff elections. So turnout's going to be higher, but I don't expect that it's going to match the November 3rd turnout. And because of that, the electorate composition is going to look a little different. The types of people who show up in runoff elections are usually older, more practiced and experienced voters who tend to know more about politics. So if Democrats in particular, who I think have a slight disadvantage, not the disadvantage that they had in 2008, the last time there was a Senate runoff election, but have a slight disadvantage because they have newer voters, they have younger voters, they're going to have to make that up with get out the vote. And so it's not just the ads that are on television, it's actually touching people, making sure that you've had a live conversation with them on the phone or in person perhaps, and just reminding them about the election, helping them navigate this unusual process where we're not used to having sort of elections at this odd time of year.
Let me ask you something about the changing demographics that you mentioned and the composition of the electorate. There's been a lot written nationally about the Latino vote, Latina vote, and what that means, and opining about whether it shifted enough for one candidate or another. What's your perception of how that's been playing out in Georgia? Because that's obviously part of our demographic base now, and in ways that are changing.
Well, in the presidential election, we did note, according to the exit polls, that Donald Trump improved his vote share amongst African-American and Hispanic voters in particular. But the overall trends in terms of partisanship and voting behavior still held. So yes, I acknowledge that we saw those shifts and those upticks in support for Donald Trump. But overall, about 90% of African Americans voted for Joe Biden, and Latino voters were sort of, majority, sort of over 60% voting for Joe Biden. Donald Trump didn't do as well amongst Latino voters as George W. Bush did in 2004. So yeah, I see the change. The change was actually relatively small. And so I expect that Latino and Asian American voters in Georgia are not as Democratic as their African-American counterparts are, but they break more Democratic than Republican, actually even approaching sort of a 2-to-1 margin. And so this, with their growing population and a really strong African-American voting base that makes up 30% of registered voters in the state, can, with enough liberal white support, be competitive in elections. That's why Georgia is in the position that it's in. And it's why Georgia looks different than South Carolina or Alabama or Mississippi, where you don't have that same level of diversity, and where you don't even have that same level of ideological heterogeneity amongst white voters as well.
Let me ask one last question, sort of looking forward beyond the Senate runoffs. Is there anything here that you're using to think about the statewide elections in 2022 and maybe even beyond? You referenced, we always use this language of flip, but the way you were describing it earlier, it made it sound like flipping once it's not a permanent flip. It's more like a flip flop, that can go back the other way. Is that where you think we're going to be for a while?
So I think that, based on the trajectory in gubernatorial races, that same narrowing of margins that we have seen in presidential elections, we've observed in gubernatorial elections as well. Roy Barnes lost by 10 points. In 2010, Jason Carter lost by about 7 or 8 points in 2014, and then Stacey Abrams loses by 1.5 points. So the gubernatorial races are certainly on that trajectory. I expect that it's very likely that we're going to see a rematch between Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp in 2022. And so that race is going to be highly competitive. And Stacey Abrams is going to use everything that she's learned, sort of narrowing margins and helping to flip Georgia in the presidential election in her own gubernatorial bid. But what I expect to happen is that this isn't sort of, you can shut a light switch off and all of a sudden you go from being solidly Republican to being solidly Democratic. And I've been thinking about this a lot, and I'm not quite sure exactly how I'm going to write about it, but I think I am at some point thinking about Georgia is going to start to look a little like North Carolina. I think a lot of people thought, and I'm from Virginia. Virginia flipped, and then, it started to make its transition, and it wasn't exactly linear, but it started to look pretty linear that once it started to vote Democratic, then it started to vote Democratic in gubernatorial elections, and then finally the General Assembly switched over. North Carolina's been much more uneven, where we've had Democratic and Republican senators, we've had Democratic and Republican governors. And I think that Georgia's probably headed in the same direction that North Carolina is now, where there will be some breakthrough Democratic victories, but they're going to be places where Republicans are going to hold. And that actually isn't different. If we look at the 80s and 90s when Sam Nunn wasn't running for Senate races, Democrats and Republicans won Senate races by these really narrow margins. And so I think that that's what we just have to be prepared for the next decade.
Thanks for that. That's a really interesting set of analogies. Let me ask David to think a little bit about some of the questions you raised about both how the parties are reaching voters successfully, and especially as we move to this period of trying to reach voters and motivate voters in unusually timed runoff elections. What are you seeing out there, David, as an expert in marketing, that's been effective, less effective? How are the candidates and the parties cutting through the noise?
So I've lived in Philadelphia, I've lived in Wisconsin, both states that we traditionally think of as battleground states. So I'm used to seeing the high volume of advertising that typically accompanies all of the elections. I was a little bit surprised to see it in Georgia. As Andra had said, we expected it to be close. I didn't know how close it was going to be and how much money was going to be pouring into the state. I mean, you turn on a television, today, you're probably going to see wall-to-wall advertisements for the runoff elections.
Right.
And so typically the way we think about political advertising is that it has two purposes. It's either to persuade people, to get them to see your side of things, to get them to vote for your candidate, or it's to get them to show up. I suspect, given that we're just coming out of a tight election, I suspect most people have kind of made up their mind who they're going to vote for already. So I think it's going to be a question of how effective is that advertising at getting people to show up to vote. And I think I'd seen something in the last couple of days of kind of record number of absentee ballots being requested for the runoff election. So I think that it's working as far as maintaining the level of engagement that people have had, but the television advertising is part of it. Andra had mentioned kind of the get out the vote efforts, kind of typically in-person type activity. Well, that's difficult right now given where we are with COVID. So I don't know the extent to which that's going to be able to play a role. I suspect we will see some more of that activity. I would expect to see some of the heavy hitters on both sides of the aisle coming down to Georgia to support those get out the vote efforts. So whether it's Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, or the Obamas coming down, I would expect to see the big names from both parties, Vice President Pence, President Trump, are we going to see them come down? I would certainly put that in the realm of possibility as far as trying to energize those bases to show up and vote. The other factor that I'd put in there typically would be the role that social media can play in the elections. And we've been caught in a little bit of an odd time, kind of backlash to 2016 and the role that social media played in spreading disinformation. Many of the social media platforms have decided, because of how close we expected 2020 to be, because we want to limit misinformation, we're not going to allow for paid advertising after the November election. Well, given that close timing that we have, we're not seeing as much paid advertising on the social media platforms for the two Senate races. We are seeing the candidates be active themselves on social media. Again, it's another way of engaging with your constituents, attempting to kind of, in a rough sense, serve as a proxy for the lack of in-person events that we might be able to have.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the steps that you talked about that social media companies like Facebook and Twitter made, do you have any sense yet of how effective they were in combating misinformation? Do you have a sense of whether, I felt like we were moving toward the possibility of much more heavily regulating social media before the election, whether this will accelerate or decelerate that trend?
Yeah, the likelihood of that happening, I think, may hinge on the outcome of the runoff elections, depending on, do we end up with a Republican-controlled Senate versus Democrat-controlled Senate? In some sense, there's a lot of heterogeneity in the thought around should social media companies be regulated and should they be held responsible for the content that's posted on their platforms. And President Trump had said, well, there's bias against conservatives, and for that reason, I think they need to be regulated. The other way of looking at it is just the influence that these platforms have on our daily lives. Should they be liable for the content that they're enabling to be disseminated? I think that's a valid debate that we need to have. In one way of thinking about this is that these social media platforms have become the de facto publishers. They are now the de facto news outlets. There was a Pew Center study that came out a couple of years ago that said social media is the primary place that the majority of Americans get their news.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and the news organizations themselves recognize this, and because of that, are posting their content on social media to attract that audience. So I think there's a debate to be had on, do we need more regulation around social media as far as misinformation, as far as the damage that it can potentially cause? But as far as the misinformation that came out, I give the companies credit for their efforts. I mean, combating misinformation is like a game of whack-a-mole. You spot one thing and you're able to kind of to tamp that down, but you never know where the next piece of misinformation is going to come from. And so this is a very resource-intensive investment to try to combat misinformation.
And is there something especially difficult about, we are now in this statewide election. I mean, it's not that local, but statewide election that is going to have national, international attention. That's a strange environment for social media to respond to.
Yeah, I mean, social media is not constrained by geography, and so we're seeing, okay, because we have this runoff election, we're seeing tons of money being poured into television advertising, and a lot of that money coming from PACs. I know Karl Rove's PAC was paying for some of the advertising that I saw this morning. The activity that we end up seeing on social media, though, it knows no boundaries. So it could be people, it could be groups based in Georgia, it could be groups based in North Carolina, based in DC, based in Washington State. And there's really no distinction that's made amongst those different groups. With social media, the content that you're exposed to is largely up to you. And that's why we end up with these echo chambers, that I connect to people who are similar to me. If you're like most people, your friends probably have similar political views to you. You're unlikely to reach across the aisle in forming connections just because of the content that appeals to you. And so the content you see tends to be the content that's going to resonate with you, and more rather than introduce you to kind of content that is conflicting with your worldview, it's going to reinforce that worldview. And so that's where the new social media platform, or relatively new platform, Parler, that's gained a lot of followers recently. People saying, oh, we're leaving Twitter because there's conservative bias, and we're going to move to Parler, and you should follow us there. And so, yeah, I don't think the geography is going to play a role, but I do think kind of the echo chambers that have emerged, it's just reinforcing what's already happened. You're speaking to your base, you're not really winning over any new followers. You're not getting, as voters, we're not being exposed to that breadth of information. So even though we can say, we're in a digital age, information's at our fingertips, we don't go out and get it.
Mm-hmm. And that doesn't feel like it's about to change anytime soon.
I would not expect it to.
Let me ask Chris, who works broadly across the aisle, I think across Georgia, with business leaders, how this state of political transition that we've been describing and this national attention, what this means to different members of the business community. Will this affect how Georgia is perceived as a place to do business? Will it affect literally the regulations that Georgia businesses experience? What are you seeing and hearing as you talk with leaders from across the state?
Well, Michael, thanks for having me today. And I'll just say, listen, we love it when Georgia's on your mind. Listen, we pay a lot of money for that. This is not the kind of Georgia on my mind that we're crazy about. So it's a little different than what we're used to dealing with. But listen, at the end of the day, the business community, whether they're in Georgia or anywhere else, we thrive on consistency. We're fine with regulations. We're fine with whatever the laws are, as long as we know what the path is going to be and you don't change the rules on us. And, when we look at the particularly legislation in Georgia, maybe even at the federal level, for example, go back to this past session in June where we worked really hard when a broad coalition to pass hate crimes legislation in Georgia. We were able to do that because it was a bipartisan effort. The business community was there, community organizations were there, but Republicans and Democrats came together. When you look at issues that we're dealing with, I've been on a Zoom call for 3 hours today earlier on transportation.
So sorry.
Yeah, like I'm teaching on transportation, right? If we want to deal with climate change, if we want to deal with COVID relief, all of those things that are top of mind and important for the business community require Republicans and Democrats to work together. So this idea that we're becoming more purple really doesn't bother businesses. It's not something you wake up caring about. What you care about are the character of those men and women that do get elected, and you hope that they're more centrist at the end of the day, that they're, we get worried when you're far to the right or you're far to the left. That's where businesses get worried, and that's where you get undue regulations or you get changes in competitiveness policy that impact our ability to hire people and thrive and grow. But as long as you keep that balance in the middle, and back to Andra's point, when we think about what Georgia is going to look like in the future, it's worth having a conversation about redistricting and what that impact is going to be, because we do start to care about what that looks like and what that impact is. So, yeah, I'd say generally we're driven by policy first. And I think businesses, listen, we want fiscal conservative policy. You tend to want social policies that's a little more moderate out there because, quite frankly, you want to recruit the talent to Georgia. It used to be when I started in economic development 20 years ago, it was location, location, location. That's what businesses wanted. Today, they want talent, talent, talent. And so businesses do want to weigh in on policy discussions like a religious liberty bill, for example, because it might turn off or give us a bad reputation as a state of somewhere where, if I'm gay, lesbian, if I am a minority, if I'm disabled, I might not want to come to this state because of these bills. Well, we're going to fight against that type of legislation. So those types of policy issues do matter to businesses. We're going to work with whoever's in there every day. We just hope that they're willing to work with the business community.
Yeah. Well, let me pick up something where you started actually before all that, which is very helpful, which is the fact that Georgia is on everybody's mind. I happened to listen to the BBC, World Service last night, and sure enough, their top story was about Georgia. You can't, get a New York Times today without reading a story or two about Georgia. As you said, if we are trying to recruit talent to Georgia, and I'm the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, so one of my jobs is to recruit and retain talent to Georgia as well. Does having Georgia in this national, international spotlight help, hinder? Is it just noise that goes away after this runoff is completed?
Well, we hope the noise goes away after the runoff.
I know you'd like to be able to turn on the television without sitting through 2.5 minutes of political ads, at least.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Michael, right? So if you look at where Georgia is right now from an economic development standpoint, we have more projects in the pipeline than we've seen in forever, right? You're seeing the reshoring, you're seeing things that are happening globally, some because of COVID, some because it was happening already, that are bringing an enormous number of projects to Georgia. And one of the reasons they're looking here is because they do think they can find the talent. So from a standpoint of being able to tell the story, I did an op-ed today where I said, yes, you've got the negativity out there, but there's a lot of good news stories that are happening in Georgia too. We just have to tell those stories. I think where it gets negative and difficult is when you hear this drumbeat of rigged elections or things that are, that somehow things have been subterfuged out there. That's not good for us. That doesn't help the brand. It doesn't help us grow Georgia. It doesn't help us bring jobs here. But the political piece of it, I think most people understand it's a political year. That's not going to impact their ability to look at Georgia. It's not going to influence them. The policies that might come will influence them much more than seeing a bunch of negative, ads on TV for the next 5 weeks.
I am looking forward to the moment where the negative ads go away. I think we all are. But it is very interesting and exciting to be at the center of the political universe for a while.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I'd like a nice, quiet holiday season instead of this excitement. But I tell you, back to Andra's point, this is not a surprise, right? I was in D.C. giving a presentation a year and a half ago on our Senate races in Georgia, and people in the audience literally said, "We will be in Georgia in December of 2020 because you're going to have 2 runoffs." And I laughed. I said, "We'll have 1 runoff. We're not going to have 2." I didn't know we would actually have 3 runoffs, right? Which we're talking about the Senate races. You also have a PSC race. So I think the political world really could look at the numbers, see where we were going, saw that 1.5% in the last gubernatorial election, and realized that we were going to be dealing with election outcomes of less than 30,000 votes here. And so, yeah, I don't think it's as big a surprise to folks that know what the numbers have been and how Georgia's been trending.
Does any of this affect advertising businesses, communications businesses? Are they happy to be the center of the universe?
Oh, they're thrilled, right? They're thrilled. Where the problem with this is, and I talked to one of my members, gosh, this was back in February, who said we're really going to have a down Christmas season this year, and they're a destination. This was before we thought about COVID, and I said, why would you be down in December and November? And he goes, because we can't afford to buy TV advertising right now. And I've heard that consistently, particularly from mid-tier and smaller companies that can't afford to get their message out. And so the Amazons of the world can tell their story, can tell you go shop there. Those mom and pops are really struggling right now. So yes, our media companies are happy with that influx of dollars right now, and most of them are thrilled. There's some that aren't seeing the numbers that they should, quite frankly, and that's a surprise to me. But overall, I'm a little more worried about what that holiday season looks like for some of those destination places and folks that you were normally used to seeing advertise their light shows and their Christmas specials this time of year that can't break through the noise.
Well, and you're right. The COVID context let's make it even more challenging for those size businesses right now. Let me sort of take some questions and we're getting in and others and circle around a little bit, and pick up on something that you were talking about, Chris. The fact that this is receiving national, international attention. Andra, from a voter standpoint, from a political demographic standpoint, does it really matter that this statewide election has become effectively nationalized, that it's receiving this kind of attention? Do voters respond to that? Are they turned off by that?
So voters will respond to personal appeals to show up to vote. And so this election is about turnout. It's not really about persuasion. So even though some of the ads and the content of the ads might try to persuade that small sliver of undecided voters, those would be low propensity voters who would be less likely to show up. And the types of people who are going to show up in the election are going to be people who had their mind made up on November 2nd, who they were going to be voting for in the runoff. So I don't expect a lot of persuasion. Sometimes that actually makes me wonder about some of the strategic moves that some of the campaigns have made, and certainly some of the things that the super PACs have made. And there's been a continuity between the runoff election and the general election in terms of the nationalization of the election. So if we look at the issues that have been brought up, whether it's the Republicans trying to paint the Democrats as socialists, the implications creation of Black Lives Matter, sort of the notion of healthcare, which is the closest that we get to actually talking about a local Georgia issue, because we can talk about it in the context of Medicaid expansion. The race was already national, and that's actually largely a function of our increasingly polarized politics in the United States. And so it doesn't allow for you to personalize issues. If we look at David Perdue's vote in particular, though he got more absolute votes than Donald Trump got, if we look at sort of the ratio of the votes, his ratio actually isn't far off from what Donald Trump did proportionally. And that's actually common with a lot of other senators. And so people are wondering like why people don't tell Donald Trump that he's wrong most of the time. It's that they see this really strong correlation between their vote and his vote, and they're afraid to buck him because he could send a tweet and say that says don't go vote for this rhino, and there are people who would actually follow that. So I think that what we're seeing here is a larger function and diagnosis of the overall malady of partisan polarization than it is anything else. And, part of this is I'm definitely influenced by my colleague, Alan Abramowitz, but I think, the data actually supports the observations that he's making. And so this race was nationalized long before we got to the runoff.
Got it. David, what about from a marketing standpoint? I haven't consumed a large amount of the advertising that's out there, but I've seen enough to know that it seems like one of the debates is about whether this is about Georgia or about the national scene, and that comes from both sides. How does being at the center of the political universe affect how the marketing strategies are unfolding?
Well, I think we can see it in terms of the messaging that the candidates are using. Both the incumbents as well as their Democratic challengers are both using language that plays into kind of this more national positioning rather than state-specific issues. We've seen, and this is both television and digital that we're seeing, that both Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue kind of positioning it as this is kind of the last stand against the Democrats controlling the White House and both houses of Congress. And then we're seeing John Ossoff's ads talking about how he's going to work with Joe Biden to get some of these priorities through. And so that's how the candidates are positioning themselves, is recognizing the polarization that we have, that it's either, okay, we're either part of the Democratic side or we're part of the Republican side. And really their messaging isn't going much beyond that.
That's interesting. Go ahead, Chris. It looks like you were jumping.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting if you go back and look at some of our recent Senate races, and I think particularly about Zell Miller running for the Senate, and I think about Johnny Isakson running in his last time when Trump was on the ballot. Both of those candidates outperformed the president, literally 200, 300,000 votes, right? Johnny was up, I think, 500,000 votes. Zell was 600,000 votes in his race. And I was with Johnny when he was asked about Trump during that election. And Johnny said, this race is about Georgia. I'm talking about Georgia issues. It's a very different mindset than what we're looking at in 2020. Both those candidates said, I'm going to talk about Georgia more, focus on my relationships here, not worry about what's happening in DC. They were extremely successful. And, kind of like Andra and Dave were saying, I question sometimes the strategy here that we're seeing, but I think it just points to the world as much more polarized than it ever has been before. But I just keep looking back to those very popular Georgia politicians that were able to say, this is who I am on the strength of character, and run a very different race and be very effective and successful.
And just to follow up on that, one of the factors that may be contributing to that is we have different messaging coming from PACs and candidates. Right. And so given how much interest we're seeing from outside the state, that may be affecting kind of what we're taking away from it.
Andra, do you think that the kind of candidate and campaign that Chris was talking about a second ago, the Zell Miller, the Johnny Isakson, who could kind of run with a little bit of distance from the national politics, do you think that's going to be possible in the near future, given the polarization that you're talking about and these small margins?
Not right now. The casualty of polarization is the end of the personal vote. And that's what Chris is observing. And, it's also Zell Miller and Johnny Isakson had years to cultivate that level of support. And we see, to the extent that we saw personal vote, we saw it amongst well-seasoned politicians who were able to do it in their own states. So Susan Collins defied the polls in part because she's got a longstanding relationship with constituents in Maine. Ben Sasse did well in Michigan, where he outperforms Donald Trump. Tom Cotton did the same thing in Arkansas. But the margins, I didn't look at numerically, I just looked at it kind of in terms of percentage points, is that, they, were doing 5-6 percentage points better than Donald Trump was in their respective states. And for Kelly Loeffler, who is brand new, nobody knew who she was, a year ago today. Like, she just didn't have the opportunity to be able to cultivate that. I think when we go back and do the postmortem on this race, I think we're going to ask about the wisdom of some of her choices, given her profile, given her business profile. I mean, just the idea that she was irritated all of her employees in the WNBA, I think is a discussion about what's going on. And then actually sort of thinking about David Perdue, a relative newcomer. So comes with the strong family name, but I mean, he's still relatively new. And so his socialization period is during the age of Trump. So he hasn't actually been able to break away and cultivate his own identity in the way that Zell Miller could, or in the way that Johnny Isakson could. So, I mean, part of this is we are in, a totally different time. And then these are also very new politicians who, are, inexperienced and haven't had the time to cultivate that particular following.
Chris also brought up the topic of redistricting, which I think is an interesting topic to think about in this context. How are you seeing redistricting possibly playing out, Andra, in the state?
Well, I mean, here's where paying attention to the down ballot actually matters. And so it doesn't matter who wins the presidency. It doesn't even matter who controls Congress. Redistricting happens at the state legislative level. And so Democrats did actually try to flip state legislatures, and they were unsuccessful in doing so. So the story of the 2020 cycle is that Donald Trump may be defeated, but many of his allies still managed to get reelected. And so going into the 2021 redistricting cycle, there are Democratic controlled legislatures where, if they are not barred because of nonpartisan redistricting commissions, will have sway and very few rules and guidelines about how to redraw districts. So, the basic rules are, you got to put the same number of people in each district. Mm-hmm. Race can't be the primary sort of determination of who you're putting in districts. However, you can do whatever you want in terms of party. And there is litigation because party and race tend to be very correlated with one another. And so that's where the challenges come up. But the Supreme Court seems to be averse to trying to limit redistricting on the nature of pure partisanship. And so from a normative level, what this means is that states are really going to have to grapple with whether or not they actually should be letting partisans draw their own district lines and draw district lines for members of their party. We haven't, come close to really having a serious conversation about that in Georgia, but this is a conversation I think every state should be having.
And Chris, you said that there were concerns among your constituents about the effects of redistricting and how it would play out.
Sure. I mean, listen, what you'd love to do is you wish that candidates would go in and you would decide on the value of what they bring to the table, right? Their experience, their position. And instead, if you're not careful in a redistricting situation, you actually end up having all your elected officials chosen in the primary instead of in the general election, because you're going to draw the Republican districts more Republican, the Democratic districts more Democratic. And so they're going to be more to the left, more to the right. And it's going to be harder to find that middle ground at the end of the day. What you'll see this upcoming year in Georgia is a special session for redistricting. They're going to have those same questions. Yes, very well might start seeing some Democrats win statewide office in 22 or 24, 26, but it's highly likely you'll have the Georgia General Assembly controlled by Republicans at least through the next decade. But who are those men and women going to be? Are they going to be, radicals on the far left and far right? Are they going to be willing to work together like a lot of the folks that we get to work with every day in the General Assembly? I think Speaker Ralston has been trying to make this point in Georgia for the last at least 4 years to his colleagues. Let's focus on those issues that bring people together. Let's focus on kitchen table issues and get away from some of the the more polarizing issues that drive your base out to vote every year. And so when you get into this 2022 cycle, gosh, you're going to just see, I think, all the far left, far right legislation come up that takes all the oxygen out of the room. And then you're not able to work on things like transportation or trade policy or education reform, things that are, Medicaid waivers, things that are very important to everyday Georgians and to the business community.
So David, when I hear Chris talk, I think about all those areas of bipartisan interest or set of issues. And I know lots of people who always say that they're interested in those and want to make progress on them. And yet it feels like, to Andra's point about polarization, when I look at political advertising, it's not playing to those set of people might say they want bipartisanship, but they seem to respond to extreme partisanship in terms of political messaging. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if we look at the activity, the choices that people make in terms of the content of their advertising, in terms of the type of language that they use in whether it's their speeches, their advertising, their social media posts, that tells us a lot about are they trying to kind of widen their audience, or are they really just preaching to the choir? And one of the things we've seen in some of the work we've done is if we look at, for example, the emotionality of language, well, its effectiveness depends on, is it a state that is solidly leaning toward one party, or is it a state that's a little bit more heterogeneous, that's going to be more of a battleground state? And that extreme language that people use, it works well when the state leans toward one party. It doesn't work well when you've got a diverse population. Again, go back to some of the challenges that we see, and as much as social media offered the potential of bringing people together, forming those connections, what we tend to see more of is kind of people finding their own sub-network and staying within that network, not trying to reach out to others that may have different viewpoints than them.
Andra, I know that political scientists don't like to be in the realm of predicting the future. But I'm gonna make you uncomfortable anyway. Do you feel like the state of political polarization is going to survive President Trump's departure from the national stage? I guess.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah. I mean, the fever hasn't broken yet. And it makes me really sad to say I don't think we've hit rock bottom yet in terms of our polarization. So, we haven't had that big moment yet where people are actually willing to come together. Not only are we polarized, and it's not just that, the political science literature sort of in terms of who takes in media, for people who are avid media consumers who are actually very well fixed in their policy preferences and positions, right? They could hear conflicting information. They just double down on what they already believed anyway. So there's also a certain lack of openness to kind of what's going on. And the people who could be the most persuadable are usually the ones who aren't paying attention anyway. So you've got an education problem for some sector, and then we don't agree. We don't have a common set of facts. We disagree on sort of basic things like, hundreds of thousands of dead people didn't vote in Pennsylvania, to, slavery, we can trace the origins of slavery in America to 1619, and we should talk about that. Or slavery was the cause of the Civil War, right? Like these are things that are actually hotly contested because they've become, because they've been and have always been politicized. But we don't have arbiters kind of coming together who are respected enough to say, you know what, I can't convince everybody with fringe thoughts that that's wrong. But here is sort of what the canon looks like, right? And it's in part because that canon was dominated for so long by certain types of people and excluded others that everybody now feels the right to sort of be the arbiter of their own facts and their own interpretation of things. And so, I still feel a sense of loss. And I still am trying to figure out sort of what's the best way to combat misinformation and to not always change people's minds, but to at least get people to think differently and to be open to hearing things from different people.
That's a kind of nice place as we near the end of our session. There's a reminder of the work that we have to do at Emory as part of one of the institutions that plays a role in the city and the region in terms of educating the citizenry, in terms of creating civic discourse, and in terms of bringing people together from diverse viewpoints, not necessarily to do with their own set of facts, but to argue about the interpretation of those facts and also to disseminate them. And so I want to thank the three of you for being part of that today and allowing us to convene you virtually and share a little of what Emory does with people across, I guess, across the world. Hello, BBC. Welcome to Georgia. We do other things here at the National Politics. Let me just open up the floor for any last words. I don't want to force anybody to make a prediction about what will happen on January 5th. I'm not sure that would be good for us, but a last word or observation from each of you. David?
Yeah, I think we're in for, in terms of the volume of messaging that we're going to get hit with, in terms of the celebrity endorsements that are probably going to come through, both political celebrities and otherwise. Yeah, I think, at least on a positive side, we can point to the turnout from the general election was very high, and best case scenario be that we see a similarly high level of turnout for the runoff. That's
great. Chris?
Michael, thanks for letting me be with you today. And I just want to thank Emory for the great work you do, not just in Atlanta, but in Georgia and across the whole country. And thanks for helping have these types of dialogues. I think they're so vitally important. I'll just ask people to go vote. I think that's the most important thing. Encourage your employees, your family, your friends to get out there and vote and let your voice be heard over the next few weeks. And then let's, as my 14-year-old son says, math don't lie. And then let's move on from there.
That's a beauty of 14. There are a few years where math was lying in our house. So congratulations on making it to the other side. Andra.
I won't predict who's going to win the election, but I expect that the race is going to be close, a lot closer than it was in 2008. I expect that turnout's going to be robust, if not record-breaking, for a runoff election. And I think ultimately who wins comes down to get out the vote, GOTV. So whichever side is better organized in terms of reaching their voters is going to be the side that wins. And I think that they're going to be highly correlated together. So there isn't going to be split ticket voting unless there's some bombshell that comes out about one of these candidates in the next couple of weeks.
Great. Well, thank you again for being with us, and thanks to everybody who tuned in. And as Chris said, we do encourage all of our Georgia citizens to go out and vote. And for those of you who are tuning in from across the country and across the world, you have to wait till your next election to do so. But in the meantime, please stay engaged with us here at Emory. And thank you for being part of our community. Have a great afternoon.